The New York Times is reporting this afternoon that President Trump is moving to demand that the Justice Department financially compensate him for the various federal investigations into him. What exactly does he want? Nearly $250 million, $230 million to be exact. The Times is reporting that the president filed complaints related to the investigation into possible connections between his 2016 campaign and Russia, as well as the 2022 case around classified documents, where the president reportedly alleges the FBI violated his privacy by searching his Mar-a-Lago property.
Okay, so here's where we are right now. A federal judge just ordered the release of internal Trump administration documents. And yeah, these aren't just any documents. We're talking about files that allegedly expose what some members of Congress are calling the most blatant corruption scheme they've ever seen. In the response, multiple lawmakers are now publicly demanding Trump's arrest, like actually calling for him to be arrested right now while he's sitting in the White House. Can you believe this? This whole thing centers around something absolutely wild. Trump is demanding, and I want you to hear this number clearly, $230 million from the Department of Justice, from the DOJ, the same DOJ that's supposed to be investigating crimes, the same DOJ that's supposed to be independent. Trump wants them to just hand over $230 million, and he's claiming it's for damages. Damages. Like the Justice Department somehow owes him a massive payday. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. And look, I know we've seen a lot of stuff over the years, a lot of scandals, a lot of headlines that made us shake our heads. But this is different, because we're not talking about tweets. We're not talking about controversial statements or policy disagreements. We're talking about actual documents, court-ordered documents that allegedly show a pay-for-favor scheme happening inside the executive branch. The judge didn't just suggest these documents should be released. The judge ordered it, which means there's enough there, enough evidence, enough smoke, that a federal judge looked at this situation and said, yeah, the public needs to see what's in these files. Now, here's what makes this even more insane: the timing. Trump just filed a formal appeal in his hush money felony conviction. You remember that case? The one where he was actually convicted, found guilty by a jury. Well, he's appealing that right now.
President Trump wants a New York State appeals court to toss out his hush money criminal conviction. In a court filing late last night, his lawyers argued there was no intent to commit a crime and the evidence was not sufficient to convict. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office prosecuted the case and will have a chance to respond in court. We did reach out to them and they declined to comment. In May of last year, Trump was convicted of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records to conceal a hush money payment to an adult film star over an alleged affair.
And while that appeal is happening, while he's trying to overturn a felony conviction, these corruption files are being released and Congress is losing it. Representative Jamie Raskin, who sits on the House Judiciary Committee, he came out on October 21st and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "We want the entire paper trail, every piece of correspondence, every memo, every single record between the White House and the Department of Justice." And then he added, if we had subpoena power, we would be going after that right now. Think about that for a second. A sitting member of Congress is saying out loud that if they had the power to force these documents into the open, they would do it immediately, because they believe there's something there, something big enough, something corrupt enough that it demands immediate investigation. And it's not just Raskin. Representative Negus, along with other members, they literally erupted during congressional hearings. Erupted, calling this a civic emergency. Some of them, and yeah, this is real, some of them are urging arrest, if the evidence gets verified, arrest of a sitting president. When was the last time you heard that level of urgency from Congress? When was the last time lawmakers stood up in hearings and used words like civic emergency to describe what's happening in the executive branch? This story went absolutely viral after The Daily Show covered it on October 23rd. They called Trump's $230 million demand nakedly corrupt. Nakedly corrupt. And it wasn't just left-leaning outlets. Ben Shapiro, who's not exactly known for attacking Trump, even he condemned this move. When you've got The Daily Show and Ben Shapiro on the same side of an issue, that tells you something. Political newsletters, Substack analysts, independent journalists, they're all calling this unprecedented. They're using phrases like tramples on constitutional checks and balances. And honestly, that's not hyperbole.
It's unconstitutional. Why? Because Article 2, Section 1, Clause 7 of the Constitution says the president is entitled to his official salary and not a dollar more and not a dollar less. Congress can't reduce his salary. Congress can't increase his salary. He can't take any other money.
So he can't get this money?
No, he can't take this money because it's coming from federal agencies, and federal agencies and departments can't give him a dollar, nor can the states do it. But just like he blew right past the Foreign Government Emoluments Clause and is still doing it, like with that $400 million airplane grift gift from Qatar, he thinks that he can just take $230 million from the American taxpayers. So, you know, America has got to rise up on a bipartisan, transpartisan, nonpartisan basis to say, no, this cuts against one of the central pillars of the Constitution, which is the presidency is not a money-making operation for the guy who gets in and for his family.
Because if the president of the United States can just demand hundreds of millions of dollars from the Department of Justice, and if there's evidence that this is part of some kind of pay-for-favor scheme, then yeah, we're talking about a fundamental breakdown in how our government is supposed to function. So here's where we're at. A federal judge ordered documents released. Congress is demanding answers. Some lawmakers are calling for arrest. The president is appealing a felony conviction. And at the center of it all is this $230 million question. Why does Trump think the DOJ owes him that money? What's in those documents? And what happens next? Because this isn't going away. This is the story defining the political conversation right now. And as we head toward the 2026 midterms, as Democrats signal they'll issue subpoenas if they regain power, the stakes couldn't be higher. The whole situation is creating this massive divide. You've got some people saying this is the accountability moment we've been waiting for. Finally, actual evidence, actual documents, actual consequences. And then you've got others saying this is just more political attacks, more witch hunts, more attempts to take down a president. But here's the thing. A federal judge doesn't order documents released because of politics. A judge looks at evidence, looks at the law, and makes a decision based on whether the public interest outweighs executive privilege. And in this case, the judge said yes. That alone should tell you this isn't just partisan noise. We're at a crossroads moment. And depending on what these documents actually reveal, we could be looking at one of the biggest political earthquakes in modern American history. Or, if the documents don't show what Congress thinks they show, then this becomes ammunition for Trump supporters to say, see, it was all overblown, all exaggerated. Either way, we're about to find out. Let's break this thing down. All right, so let's talk about what's actually happening here. Because the headline sounds insane, and honestly it kind of is, but there's a whole chain of events that led to this moment. And if you don't understand the full picture, you're going to miss why this is such a big deal. First, let's establish the basic facts. Trump is demanding $230 million from the Department of Justice. Now, when most people hear that, their first question is, wait, how can a president just demand money from a government agency? Isn't that not how things work? And yeah, you're right to be confused, because on paper, this doesn't make sense. The president doesn't just get to submit an invoice to the DOJ and expect a check. But here's what Trump is claiming. He's saying the Justice Department owes him damages. Damages for what? Well, that's where things get murky. And conveniently, that's also where these newly released documents come in. The documents that the federal judge ordered to be released, their internal communications, memos, correspondence between the White House and DOJ officials, and according to multiple members of Congress who've seen portions of this stuff, these files show a pattern of the Trump administration allegedly using its power over the Justice Department to benefit Trump personally. Now let's be super clear about what we're talking about here. We're talking about a potential pay-for-favor scheme, which means if these allegations are true, Trump or people acting on his behalf were essentially trading government actions for personal benefit. You do this for me, I do that for you, except when the president is doing it. It's not just unethical, it's potentially criminal. And look, I know some of you are thinking, okay, but we've heard corruption allegations before. What makes this different? Here's what makes it different. A federal judge looked at the evidence and said this needs to be public. Judges don't do that lightly, especially when we're talking about internal White House communications. There's usually a ton of executive privilege protecting that stuff. But this judge essentially said, nope, the public interest in seeing these documents outweighs any privilege claims, which tells you there's something substantial here. Representative Jamie Raskin's comments on October 21st really nail why Congress is so fired up about this. He didn't just say, oh, we'd like to see those documents. He said we want the entire paper trail, every correspondence, every memo, every record between the White House and DOJ, and if we had subpoena power, we'd be forcing this into the open. right now. Think about the implications of that statement. Raskin is basically saying, we believe there's enough evidence of wrongdoing that we need to see everything, not just a few documents, everything, the full scope of communication between Trump's White House and the Justice Department. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Trump just filed his appeal in the hush money case, the case where he was convicted, where a jury found him guilty. And now, while that appeal is pending, these corruption allegations are exploding into public view. The timing is, let's just say, not great for Trump. Because when you're trying to convince an appeals court that your conviction should be overturned, the last thing you want is a completely separate corruption scandal dominating the headlines. And this isn't some partisan blog making accusations. This is a federal judge ordering documents released. This is multiple members of Congress calling it a civic emergency. During the congressional hearings, Representative Negus and others didn't hold back. They erupted. That's the word being used. Erupted. They're calling this situation a threat to democracy, a breakdown of constitutional checks and balances. And some of them are going even further, saying that if the evidence in these documents is verified, Trump should be arrested. Now, arresting a sitting president, that's a huge deal, like historically unprecedented level huge. The closest we've come was Nixon, and he resigned before it got to that point. So when sitting members of Congress start using the word arrest in relation to the president, you know this isn't just political theater. These are serious allegations backed by what they believe is serious evidence. Let's talk about the public reaction for a second, because this story went viral in a way that most political stories don't. The Daily Show covered it on October 23rd. In their take, they called Trump's $230 million demand nakedly corrupt. Nakedly, as in not even trying to hide it, as in so obvious that you'd have to be willfully blind not to see it. And here's what's wild. Ben Shapiro, who's built his career largely on defending conservative positions and often defending Trump, even he came out against this. Shapiro condemned the $230 million demand. When you've got the political spectrum from The Daily Show to Ben Shapiro agreeing that something is corrupt, that's remarkable. These are not people who agree on much of anything. But on this, they're both saying, yeah, this is wrong. The story spread through political newsletters. Substack became a hotbed of analysis. Independent journalists started digging in. And the consensus language that keeps appearing, unprecedented corruption, trampling on constitutional checks and balances, civic emergency, these aren't terms people use lightly, especially in 2025, when we've all become somewhat numb to political scandals. We've seen so much over the past decade that it takes a lot to genuinely shock people anymore. But this is breaking through that noise. This is making people who normally tune out political news sit up and pay attention. And there's a reason for that. Because at its core, this story is about whether the president is above the law. It's about whether someone can use the power of the presidency to benefit themselves financially. It's about whether the Department of Justice, which is supposed to be independent, can be turned into a personal piggy bank or a tool for personal vendettas. Those are fundamental questions, not left questions or right questions. Fundamental American questions about how power works, about what limits exist on that power, and about what happens when those limits get crossed. The documents that are being released, they're going to show us a lot more. But even without seeing every page, we already know enough to understand why Congress is treating this like a five-alarm fire. Because if a president can demand hundreds of millions of dollars from a government agency, if there's evidence of a pay-for-favor scheme, if the DOJ is being used as a personal tool rather than an independent law enforcement body, then we've got a serious problem. And here's the thing. This isn't the first time Trump's faced accusations like this. These expanding allegations echo previous controversies, high-profile pardons that look sketchy, crony appointments, other alleged pay-to-play schemes. So there's a pattern here, a history. And now, with these court-ordered documents coming out, we might finally get to see the receipts. What's also interesting is how this connects to broader concerns about DOJ independence. For years now, legal experts and constitutional scholars have been warning about the erosion of norms around the Justice Department, the idea that the DOJ should operate independently from the White House, that it shouldn't be used as a political weapon, that it should investigate crimes based on evidence, not based on who the president likes or doesn't like. And if these documents show what Congress thinks they show, then we're looking at a complete demolition of those norms. We're looking at evidence that the Justice Department was being used exactly the way it's not supposed to be used, as a tool for personal enrichment, as leverage in some kind of corrupt bargain. As we head toward the 2026 midterms, Democrats are already making it clear if we win back power, if we get subpoena authority, we're going after all of it, every document, every communication, every piece of evidence. And that means no matter what happens with these current revelations, this story isn't over, not even close. Republicans, for their part, are mostly staying quiet, which is telling. You'd expect them to come out swinging, defending Trump, calling this a witch hunt. But most of them are just silent. Maybe they're waiting to see what's actually in the documents before committing to a defense. Or maybe, and this is the scary possibility for Trump, maybe some of them have seen enough to know that defending this is going to be really hard. Okay, let's break this down into the core pieces you need to understand, because there's a lot swirling around here, and I want to make sure the key points are crystal clear. Point 1, the $230 million demand. Trump is claiming the Department of Justice owes him $230 million in damages. Now let's just sit with how absurd that sounds for a second. The president demanding a massive payout from the Justice Department. The same Justice Department that's part of his own executive branch. The same Justice Department that's supposed to be investigating federal crimes independently. What damages is he claiming? That's not entirely clear from public reporting, but what we do know is that this demand has triggered alarm bells across the political spectrum. When The Daily Show and Ben Shapiro both call something corrupt, you know it's not just partisan spin. There's something genuinely wrong here. The question everyone should be asking is this: if Trump believes he's owed money, why isn't he going through normal legal channels? Why is this being framed as a demand on the DOJ rather than a lawsuit in civil court like everyone else would have to file? The answer might be in those documents. And think about the precedent this sets. If a president can just demand money from a federal agency, what stops future presidents from doing the same thing? What stops any president from turning the federal government into their personal ATM? This isn't just about Trump. This is about what we allow presidents to do going forward. Point 2, the court-ordered documents. A federal judge ordered internal Trump administration documents to be released. These are communications between the White House and the Department of Justice, memos, correspondence, the kind of stuff that usually stays hidden behind executive privilege. But this judge said no. These need to be public. And that decision alone tells us something important. Judges don't just casually override executive privilege. They do it when there's a compelling public interest, when the evidence suggests something serious enough that it outweighs the normal protections around presidential communications. What's allegedly in these documents, according to members of Congress, evidence of a pay-for-favor scheme, evidence that Trump's administration was using the power of the Justice Department for personal benefit, trading government actions for favors, money, influence, whatever. And here's the thing, we're about to see these documents, they're being released, so this isn't speculation anymore. We're going to get the actual evidence, the actual paper trail, and that's why Congress is freaking out, because they know what's coming. Some of them have already seen portions of it, and they're calling it a civic emergency. The court order means this isn't optional. Trump can't just refuse to hand over the documents. They're coming out, and once they're public, everyone gets to see what was happening behind closed doors. That transparency, that's what makes this different from previous scandals where everything stayed hidden behind layers of classification and privilege. Point 3, Congress is demanding arrest. Multiple members of Congress, led by Representative Negus, are calling for Trump's arrest if the evidence is verified. Let that sink in. Elected lawmakers saying publicly that the president should be arrested. Representative Raskin laid out exactly what Congress wants, the entire paper trail, every communication between the White House and DOJ, and he added, if we had subpoena power right now, we'd already be forcing this stuff into the open. Which means, if Democrats win back the House in 2026, that's exactly what's going to happen. This isn't a future hypothetical anymore. This is lawmakers drawing a line in the sand and saying this crosses it. This is corruption at a level that demands accountability, even if that means arresting a sitting president. Now, will that actually happen? Honestly, probably not in the immediate term. Arresting a sitting president is almost impossible to imagine. The logistics of that, the constitutional crisis it would create, the political fallout, but the fact that serious lawmakers are even using that language, that tells you how severe they believe this situation is. And it's not just Democrats. There are whispers, quiet ones, of Republicans privately expressing concern. They're not saying it publicly yet, but behind closed doors, some of them are apparently asking the same questions. Is this defensible? Can we really stand behind this? What happens if the evidence is as bad as it seems? Point 4, the timing with the hush money appeal. While all of this is happening, Trump just filed his appeal in his hush money felony conviction. He was convicted by a jury, found guilty, and now he's trying to overturn that conviction on appeal. So picture this, Trump is simultaneously appealing a felony conviction and dealing with explosive new corruption allegations involving the DOJ and facing calls from Congress for his arrest. Oh, and demanding $230 million from the Justice Department. The optics of this are, they're terrible. When you're trying to convince an appeals court that you were wrongly convicted, you probably don't want a separate corruption scandal making headlines at the exact same time. But here we are, And this raises bigger questions. Questions about accountability, questions about whether powerful people face consequences, questions about whether the justice system works the same for everyone, or whether there's a different set of rules when you're the president. The hush money conviction already established that Trump can be held accountable in a court of law. A jury looked at the evidence, heard the testimony, and said guilty. That happened. That's not speculation. That's not political spin. That's a legal fact. And now, as he tries to undo that verdict, we've got this whole other scandal erupting. So why does this story matter right now? Let me give you 4 reasons. First, we're heading into the 2026 midterms, and this is going to be the issue. Democrats are already signaling that if they win back power, they're coming after this with everything they've got. Subpoenas, investigations, the full congressional spotlight. So this isn't just about what's happening today. This is about what the next 2 years of politics are going to look like. Every Democratic candidate is going to be asked, if you win, will you investigate this? And they're all going to say yes. Second, this is about the independence of the Justice Department, and that's not a small thing. If the DOJ can be used as a personal tool by the president, if it can be pressured into paying out huge sums of money based on the president's feelings, then we don't have an independent justice system anymore. We have a system where the most powerful person in the country gets to bend the rules however they want. The entire foundation of our legal system rests on the idea that laws apply equally, that nobody is above the law, that the Justice Department investigates crimes regardless of who committed them. If that foundation cracks, if we lose that independence, then everything else starts to crumble. Third, this is about whether anyone is above the law. We've been dancing around that question for years now, through multiple investigations, multiple scandals, multiple legal cases, and every time there's been this question hanging in the air. Does the same system of accountability that applies to regular people also apply to the president? Or is there a point where power insulates you from consequences? These documents might finally answer that question. Because if there's evidence of a pay-for-favor scheme, if there's proof that Trump used his position for personal financial gain, then we're not talking about political disagreements anymore. We're talking about crimes, clear, prosecutable crimes. And if that evidence exists, and if nothing happens, then we'll have our answer, and it won't be a good one. It'll mean that presidential power effectively puts someone beyond the reach of the law. And that's not how democracies are supposed to work. Fourth, this sets precedents for the future. Whatever happens here, whatever we allow or don't allow, that becomes the template for future presidents. If Trump can demand money from the DOJ without consequences, the next president might try something even worse. If this behavior is normalized, if it's accepted as just how things work now, then we fundamentally change what the presidency is. Here's what to watch for in the coming weeks. First, the full release of these court-ordered documents. Pay attention to what's actually in them. Don't just rely on headlines. Look at what the documents actually say. What evidence do they contain? What patterns do they show? Read beyond the summaries. Dig into the details, because that's where the truth lives, in the specifics, in the documented communications, in the paper trail. Second, watch how Congress responds. Are there more hearings? Do more lawmakers join the calls for accountability? Does anyone on the Republican side break ranks and say, yeah, this is too far? The congressional response will tell us a lot about where this is headed politically. Third, watch the legal proceedings, both the hush money appeal and any new investigations that might spin out of these DOJ corruption allegations, because the courts are going to play a huge role in how this all shakes out. Judges, juries, prosecutors, they're the ones who ultimately decide whether laws were broken and what consequences follow. And fourth, watch the polls, watch public opinion, because ultimately in a democracy, that matters. If the public sees this evidence and says, yeah, that's corrupt, that's unacceptable, then there's pressure on the system to respond. But if the public shrugs and moves on, then that tells us something too. It tells us we've become so numb to corruption that even documented evidence doesn't move the needle anymore. This is the biggest political story happening right now, not because it's the loudest, not because it's the most dramatic, but because it's asking the most important question. Can a president be held accountable? Or are we living in a system where power means you're untouchable? We're about to find out. And honestly, I'm not sure which answer is scarier, that we'll try to hold him accountable and fail, or that we won't even try. The documents are coming, Congress is mobilizing, the courts are engaged, and the American public is watching. What happens next is going to define not just Trump's presidency, but the presidency itself, the power of that office, the limits of that power, and whether those limits mean anything at all. Next time, we're going to dig into what happens if Democrats actually do win back the House in 2026, what their investigation would look like, what subpoena power actually means, and why Trump should be very worried about that possibility. Because if you think this is bad, Just wait until Congress has the full authority to compel testimony and documents. Stay tuned.